4. The reception of capital. The hope expressed by Engels that after having completed the first volume and got rid of the incubus Marx would feel a different fellow altogether was fulfilled only in part. The improvement in Marx's health was unfortunately far from permanent whilst his pecuniary situation remained embarrassingly uncertain. At about this time he even considered moving to Geneva, where he would have been able to live much more cheaply, but circumstances bound him to London and the treasures of the British Museum. He hoped to find a publisher for an English translation of his work, and he was unable and unwilling to surrender the intellectual leadership of the International before he had seen it safely started along the correct path. The marriage of his second daughter Laura to his medical Creole, Paul Lafargue, was a happy domestic event. The young couple had become engaged in August, 1866. But it had been agreed that Lafargue should first complete his medical studies before they married. He had been struck off the rolls of the University of Paris for a period of 2 years owing to his participation in a students' congress in Liège, and he then went to London in connection with the International. At first he was a follower of Proudhon and had no relations with Marx beyond visiting him as a matter of politeness to leave a card from Tolède. But fate took a hand in the usual fashion, and not long afterwards Marx wrote to Engels, "At first the young fellow attached himself to me, but it was not long before he found the daughter more attractive than the father. He is the only child of a former planter's family and his economic position is tolerably good." According to Marx's description, Lafargue was good-looking, intelligent, energetic, physically well-developed and good-hearted, but a little spoiled and nevertheless somewhat too unsophisticated. Lafargue was born in Santiago on the island of Cuba, but when he was 9 his parents took him to France. His paternal grandmother was a mulatto and through her he had Negro blood in his veins, a fact to which he referred willingly and which accounted for the subdued duskiness of his complexion and for the great whites of his eyes. Though otherwise his features were very regular, it was probably this Negro strain in him which accounted for a certain obstinacy which occasionally caused Marx to reproach him, half in annoyance and half in amusement, for his nigger skull. However, the tone of good-humored banter which they used towards each other is sufficient proof of how well they got on together. For Marx Lafargue became not only a son-in-law who brought happiness to his daughter Laura, but also a capable and dexterous assistant who proved a loyal defender of his intellectual legacy. Marx's chief worry in this period was his anxiety about his book, and on the 2nd of November, 1867, he wrote to Engels, "The fate of my book makes me nervous. I hear and see nothing. The Germans are fine fellows. Their achievements on this field as the lackeys of the English and the French and even of the Italians no doubt give them the right to ignore my work. Our friends over there don't know how to agitate. And in the meantime one must follow the Russian policy and wait. Patience is the secret of Russian diplomacy and success, but we poor creatures who live only once can starve the while." The impatience these lines betray is understandable enough, but it was not quite justified. The book had hardly been published 2 months, and in such a short space of time it was impossible to write any really thorough criticism. But both Engels and Kugelmann had done everything possible to make a noise about the book, and even Marx thought that this was most necessary for the moment in the hope of producing some effect in England also. It cannot be said that Engels and Kugelmann were over-punctilious in their efforts, but they met with a certain amount of success. They secured the publication of advance notices of the book, and even a reprint of the introduction, in quite a number of papers, including bourgeois publications, and in addition they had even prepared a piece of advertisement which was quite sensational for those days, namely the publication of a biographical article in Die Gartenlaube. When Marx requested them to stop such nonsense, "I consider that sort of thing is likely to do more harm than good and, in any case, it is beneath the dignity of a man of science." For instance, long ago Meyer's encyclopedia asked me for biographical notes, but I did not even answer their letter, much less give them the information they wanted. Every man to his taste. The article which Engels had written for Die Gartenlaube, a blurb written in great haste which would have done justice to Beto as its author described it, was finally published in Die Zukunft, Johann Jacobi's organ, which Guido Weiss had been publishing in Berlin since 1867, and then reprinted by Liebknecht in the Demokratisches Wochenblatt, but much shortened, a fact which caused Engels to observe disagreeably, "Wilhelm has now happily arrived at a stage where he dare not even say that Lassalle copied you and did it badly. He has completely emasculated the article, and why he thought it worthwhile printing at all after that only he can know." Liebknecht was, in fact, completely in agreement with the passages he cut out of the article. But he cut them out nevertheless in order to avoid giving offense to a number of Lassalleans who had just fallen away from Schweitzer and were helping to found the Eisenach faction. Later on, Marx's work received some excellent criticisms, for instance, a review by Engels in the Demokratisches Wochenblatt, one by Schweitzer in the Sozialdemokrat, and a second review by Joseph Dietzgen in the former publication. Apart from Engels' review, which naturally showed a thorough understanding of the points at issue, Marx was compelled to recognize that despite a number of errors, Schweitzer had certainly studied the book and understood its importance. Marx heard of Dietzgen for the first time after the publication of Capital, and he welcomed him as a capable philosophic brain, but without forming any excessively high opinion of him. The first expert also took the floor in 1867. This was Eugen Dühring, who reviewed the book in one of the supplements to Mayer's Encyclopedia. Although Marx felt that Dühring had not grasped the fundamentally new elements in his work, he was on the whole not dissatisfied with the review, declaring it quite decent, though he suspected that Dühring's attitude had been determined more by his hatred of Rorschach and the other university luminaries than by any real interest for or understanding of the points at issue. Engels' opinion of Dühring's review was much less favorable, and in fact his judgment was the keener, for it was not long before Dühring turned round completely and did his best to tear the book to pieces. Marx had no better luck at the hands of the other experts, and 8 years later one of these worthies, who cautiously concealed his name, oracularly informed the world that Marx was an autodidact who had overlooked a whole generation of scientific progress. After such and similar achievements on the part of the experts, the bitterness which Marx invariably showed towards them was thoroughly justified. Although he probably set down much to their malice which should have been set down to their ignorance, for they were utterly unable to grasp his dialectical method. This was also the case with men who lacked neither goodwill nor economic knowledge, but who nevertheless found it difficult to understand the book. Whilst on the other hand men who were by no means familiar with economic matters and who were more or less hostile to communism, but who had passed through the Hegelian school, spoke with the greatest enthusiasm of it. For instance, Marx was unconscionably severe in his judgment on the second edition of F. A. Lang's book on the labor question, in which the author dealt in detail with the first volume of Capital, declaring, "Herr Lang is loud in his praises, but only in order to make himself important." This was certainly not true, for Lang's honest interest in the labor question was beyond all doubt. Though Marx was right enough when he observed that Lang knew nothing of the Hegelian method and even less of the critical way in which he, Marx, had applied it. In fact, Lang turned the truth upside down when he declared that speculatively considered Lassalle was freer and more independent of Hegel than was Marx, whose speculative form adhered closely to the manner of its philosophic model and in certain sections of the book mastered its matter only with difficulties, for instance, with regard to the theory of value, to which, by the way, Lang credited no permanent worth. Freiligrot's verdict on the first volume, a copy of which Marx had presented him, was even more peculiar. Friendly relations had existed between the two men since the year 1859, although occasionally they had been overclouded through the fault of third persons, and Freiligrot was about to return to Germany, where a collection on his behalf promised him a carefree old age after the closing down of the London branch of the bank for which he worked had deprived the almost 60-year-old man of his livelihood. The last letter he wrote to his old friend, no further correspondence passed between them, contained hearty congratulations on the marriage of Marx's daughter Laura to young Lafargue and no less hearty thanks for a copy of the first volume of Capital which Marx had sent him. The study of the book had enlightened him in many ways, he declared, and had been a source of great pleasure. The success of the book would probably not be sudden and sensational, but its effect would be all the deeper and more permanent. So far so good, but then he declared, "I know that many young merchants and manufacturers in the Rhineland are enthusiastic about the book, and in such circles it will fulfill its real aim. And besides it will prove an indispensable work of reference for the scholar." It is true that Freiligrot never claimed to be anything but an economist by instinct, and all his life he hated heckling and hegeling, as he put it, but after all, he had spent almost 2 decades in the pulsating life of the English metropolis, and it was therefore an extraordinary performance on his part when he regarded the first volume of Capital as a sort of guidebook for young merchants and manufacturers, and at the utmost, besides, a reference work for scholars. Rouhet's judgment, on the other hand, was quite different. Although he hated communism like poison and was not burdened with any knowledge of economics, he had once fought courageously as a young Hegelian. It is an epoch-making work, and it sheds a brilliant, sometimes dazzling, light on the development, decline, birth pangs and the horribly painful maladies of social periods. The passages on the production of surplus value by unpaid labor, the expropriation of the workers who once worked for themselves, and the approaching expropriation of the expropriators are classic. Marx's knowledge is wide and scholarly, and he possesses splendid dialectical talent. The book is far above the intellectual horizon of many people and many newspaper writers, but it will certainly make its way despite the breadth of its plan, or perhaps it will exercise a powerful influence just for this reason. Ludwig Feuerbach passed a similar judgment, with the difference, in accordance with his own development, that he was less interested in the dialectics of the author than the fact that the book was rich in undeniable facts of the most interesting, but at the same time most horrible nature, which, he thought, went to prove the truth of his moral philosophy, that where the necessities of life were absent, moral compulsion was also absent. The first translation of the first volume appeared in Russia. On the 12th of October, 1868, Marx reported to Kugelmann that a publisher in St. Petersburg had surprised him with the information that a translation was already in print, and with the request for a photo to be used as a frontispiece. He was unwilling to refuse his good friends the Russians this little favor, and found it one of the ironies of fate that the Russians against whom he had fought in German, French and English for 25 years should always have been his patrons. His reply to Proudhon and his critique of political economy had sold nowhere so well as in Russia. Still, he was not prepared to give them all too much credit for this, and declared that it was pure Epicureanism, a desire for the extremist products that the Western world could offer. However, this was not really true. The translation appeared only in 1872, but it proved to be a serious scientific undertaking and a great success, and Marx himself declared it masterly. The translator was Danielson, better known under his pen name Nikolaon, and he was assisted in the translation of a number of the most important chapters by Lopatin, a daring young revolutionary, a very wide-awake and critical brain, a cheerful character and as stoical as a Russian peasant, taking everything as he finds it. As Marx described him after making his acquaintance in the summer of 1870, permission to publish the translation was given by the Russian censorship authorities with the following explanation. Although the political convictions of the author are completely socialist, and although the whole book is of a very definitely socialist character, the manner of its presentation is certainly not such as to make the book open to all, and in addition it is written in a strictly scientific fashion so that the committee declares the book to be immune from prosecution. The translation was published on the 27th of March, and by the 25th of May 1,000 copies, or 1/3 of the total edition, had been sold. At the same time a French translation began to appear, and also a second edition of the German original, both in 2 parts. The French edition was prepared by J. Roy with considerable assistance from Marx himself, who had the devil's own job with it and often complained that it cost him more time and trouble than if he had done the whole thing himself. However, as a consolation he was able to credit the French translation with a particular scientific value apart from the original. The first volume of Capital met with less success in England than in Germany, Russia, and France. Apparently only one short review was published, but this declared that Marx had the gift of lending even the driest economic questions a certain fascination. A longer review which Engels wrote for the Fortnightly Review, was rejected on the ground that it was too dry, although Professor Beazley, who was closely connected with the magazine, did his best to get it accepted. Marx set great hopes on an English translation, but none appeared during his lifetime.